He was part of a philosophical school called pragmatism, which is a philosophical tradition um, which basically says that you look at the practical effects of objects in your world, and your conception of those effects is the whole of your conception of the object. So pragmatism is you look at something for what it appears to do, and that is all it means. So it's kind of odd that someone with that perspective would also be very drawn to uh, religion and mysticism, but he was. Um, he wrote this book, as I mentioned, The Varieties of Religious Experience. He wrote that at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's become a really important, uh, uh, you know, uh, scholarly work in looking at religion and what it means to the world. Uh, and he used his pragmatic leanings and applied them to what many people consider to be particularly unpragmatic uh, things, such as religious experience, such as mystical experiences. His belief was that religious experience should be the primary topic in the study of religion rather than the institutions around religion. And by religious experience, he's really talking about spirituality. That's what he's really talking about. Since, as he sees it, and I believe he's absolutely on target with this, religious institutions are merely social constructs that are built around spiritual experiences. And he encourages psychologists to seek out the intense and sometimes even what he calls pathological varieties of the experience, because they represent the closest thing to a microscope of the mind. They show us, in drastically enlarged form, the normal processes of things. And he talked quite a bit about mystical experiences and what they meant, as far as what he calls religious mysticism, which he says is only one half of mysticism. Um, and the other half he thinks are results of what he calls insane, but what others might think are psychological imbalances. That might be the term that we use today. So he investigated these mystical experiences throughout his life, and he experimented with certain drugs, with the sort of the psychedelics of his time, which were chloral hydrate. This is, by the way, in the late 19th century, from about 1870 on. Chloral hydrate, amyl nitrate, nitrous oxide, and peyote. He experimented with all of these things. And he said that, for instance, it was only under the influence of nitrous oxide that he could understand the works of another great philosopher, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. So it's kind of amusing that he felt he needed to be a little bit high to understand this man's work. His approach to mysticism was that while he concluded the revelations of the mystic hold true, he didn't feel that they could hold true for everybody. They could only hold true for the mystic. But as we've seen, so many of these mystical experiences are very similar from person to person. But he's one of the first, certainly one of the first scientists or social scientists to talk about religious experiences in a way that was uh, not dismissive, but a way that was, uh, I guess you could call it scientific, for lack of a better word. He divided these experiences into, well, there he pinpointed four different aspects of these experiences. One is a passivity, a feeling of being grasped and held by a superior power not under your control. Ineffability, in other words, no way to actually use human language to describe the experience. And if you ever had one of these experiences, you know that that certainly is the case. Noetic, universal truths revealed that are unable to be acquired anywhere else. And transient. It's only a temporary experience, and then you're back to everyday experiences of life. So, now back to the Michael Pollan book. He cites Mr. James, as well he should, because he's fascinated by the fact that James was exploring these realms over a century ago. And he quotes from Mr. James, who says that our waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. At any rate, James concluded, these other states, the existence of which he believed was as real as the ink on this page, forbid a premature closing of our accounts with reality. So, which is a great description of what materialists do. They close the accounts on reality, saying that it's been defined, this is what it is, and no more. And we often do the same thing in our everyday waking consciousness. But our dreams, of course, tend to tell us something different. So how do these psychedelics change our mind, and what use of it is to us? Well, basically, what changes in the brain, if you want to look at it from a scientific point of view, neural pathways change. Every time we do something, every time we learn something new, every time we have a new experience, our neural pathways change to adapt to that experience. And what psychedelics seem to be able to do is to radically alter our neuroplasticity so that our brains can change more fluently and easier. Our brains, as we get older, the plasticity begins to atrophy. So we're not able to change the way we think about things as easily as we could do when we were children, or even when we were in our 20s. So there is, by the way, if you want to if you want confirmation about how much this research is really becoming mainstream, Science Daily at ScienceDaily.com has an entire section dedicated to what they call psychedelic drug news. And it's citing the latest research using these drugs. And this one is from June, from last month. And the summary of this research says that psychedelic drugs may have mind-altering powers in the physical sense, too. Duh. Sorry. They're saying that these drugs can change brain cells in rats and flies, making neurons more likely to branch out and connect with one another. The work supports the theory that psychedelics could help to fight depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder. According to David Olson, these are some of the most powerful compounds known to affect brain function, and it's very obvious to me that we should understand how they work. The idea that depression stems from imbalanced brain chemistry is still a popular idea, but recent studies have revealed evidence that depression manifests as structural changes in brain circuits or atrophy in parts of the brain. This doesn't mean that neurons die off during depression, but that neurites retract. Neurites are the sections of a neuron that project out to bridge the gap between two neurons at the synapse to facilitate communication. One of the hallmarks of depression is that the neurites in the prefrontal cortex, a key brain region that regulates mood and emotion and anxiety, tend to shrivel up. And so these brain changes also appear in cases of anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what happens with these compounds, these drugs, apparently there's an increase in the density of these synapses, which allows them to be to have more plasticity. And besides the rats, it's also shown to have had the same effects in humans. So Olson says if we fully understand the signaling pathways that lead to neuroplasticity, we might be able to target critical nodes along those pathways with drugs that are perhaps safer than ketamines or psychedelics. And again, the issue of these drugs not being safe is really important to talk about, because while there are some risks, as there are risks with any drug, and we talked about not using it with certain types of psychosis, things of that nature, for the most part, these drugs are not addictive at all. They have no physical addiction. They're not even psychedelic. They're not even psychologically addictive. Although I suppose anything could potentially be psychologically addictive, but using things like LSD, the fact that your experience of them tends to lessen the more you take it. People who do take this drug, or who have taken it, don't take it compulsively in the way that you do a drug that you're addicted to, like cocaine. So it really only needs to be taken once in a while, because the effects are something that last to such a degree, from what I understand, that it's not necessary to keep taking them to keep having the experience. So it's, I think, important to begin to have a different viewpoint of these. And again, I'm not advocating that you should go out and buy these illegal drugs, because they still are classified as an illegal drug, and this research is only being done because these drugs are now being allowed to be used in clinical environments. You can't just go out and, I mean, you can, but it's not legal, and I'm not encouraging anyone to do that. What I am encouraging is if you have debilitating